Well, hello, and a very warm welcome back to the Andrew Eborn Show with me, Andrew Eborn, and I'm delighted to be joined by George Szamuely. How are you, George?
I'm good. How are you, Andrew? Long
It's
time no
always
speak.
good to see you, and thank you so much for joining us. We want to focus, first of all, on the Middle East and what's going on from that point of view. Bring us up to date.
Well, as you know, we had the other day the Israeli attack on Iran. I mean, it's always presented as Israeli retaliation against Iran, whereas if you're going to start talking about retaliations, this was after many provocations on the part of Israel. Of course, we had the very serious breach of diplomatic protocol, to say the least, when Israel attacked the Iranian consulate in Damascus, ostensibly to kill some Iranian generals. And then, of course, we had the killing of the Hezbollah leader Nasrallah. We also had the assassination in Tehran of a Hamas leader. All of these were serious provocations to Iran, and then finally Iran, made a strike against Israel. Very limited strike. It was not. It was very much limited to Israeli military targets, and now Israel has apparently made a quite limited response to that. So then the question is this the end of it, or is this just another step on the cycle of escalation? And the answer is we don't know.
Right.
It's
But
clear that,
following
yeah,
the
go on.
patterns, in history, and the press was quite positive about it today, saying that they haven't gone for a major retaliation on that sort of side. Do you think, based on your understanding of the region and history, that this is a sort of positive step, and we might actually be seeing an end rather than an escalation?
It's very hard to see anything positive. As things stand at the moment, um, Israel considers this as a moment when it can reorganize the Middle East in a very fundamental way to its advantage. It's been fighting this savage war, if one can call it that, this savage campaign in Gaza, with a view, obviously, to destroying Hamas, destroying resistance to Israel in Gaza, and probably with a view to annexing, if not the whole of Gaza, but at least a very good chunk of it, the sort of the northern Gaza, for Israel. That is an outcome. Israel is also, struck several very powerful blows against Hezbollah. I mean, it's eliminated its leadership. It's eliminated a man of the stature of Nasrallah, and clearly also sees this opportunity to reorganize events in Lebanon to Israel's advantage, kind of creating for itself a buffer zone, a very substantial buffer zone in Lebanon. And it may well see this as an opportunity to get to grips really with the last of the resistance to Israel in the Middle East, namely Iran. And so I'd be surprised if Israel were to let it go at that. So then the question is, well, why was this such a limited strike? I mean, there was all the talk about that Israel was going to attack oil refineries, it would attack oil fields. There was even talk that they would attack nuclear facilities. That didn't happen. So one possibility is Israel is waiting for the outcome of the US election,
Right.
and then it will make its move then. It's done that before, that particularly during the transition period, and it's quite possible that in the United States, the transition period is going to be quite fraught, because it may well be that there'll be no clear winner who will emerge, and there's going to be a huge post-election fight of who really won the election. So that may well be a moment for Israel to strike, because America's so distracted. Another possibility is that for once the Biden administration really leaned on Israel. So Biden people have been claiming all this time that, they're really putting pressure on Israel. Israel has just said, well, we're not interested in anything you have to say, and we're just going to do whatever we want to do. But nonetheless, the Biden people have been putting out in the media, we're very unhappy with Israel. We're really, putting pressure on them. Nothing happens. But because ultimately the Biden administration doesn't care very much about Palestinians, it doesn't care very much about Hezbollah, Lebanese, or anything like that. But in this case, it's quite possible that the Biden administration is very, very concerned that a major Israeli strike and therefore a possible major Iranian retaliation could lead to a very serious escalation and war in the Middle East, which would redound to the disadvantage of Kamala Harris. So now suddenly the Biden administration got quite agitated. Hey, Bibi, you're damaging the election prospects of the Democrats. You can't do that. So for once, they really got very agitated and may well have applied serious pressure against Netanyahu. But again, that could indicate that Israel will strike again. I tend to think that Israel will attack again.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I mean, you raise the election, and obviously it's just a matter of days now, and the polls suggest that it is very close. Who do you think would be better for world peace?
Oh, I think Donald Trump would. I think Kamala Harris really doesn't know very much about international affairs. I think she would pursue pretty much the Biden agenda, which is keep the wars going, keep the war in Ukraine going, keep the wars in the Middle East going. I mean, she obviously does not have any thoughts on the matter whatsoever. The people around her are very standard issue foreign policy types. Trump has been here before, and Trump, given that this is also his last term, may well be thinking in terms of leaving a lasting legacy. And he may well think that, well, I'd like to be the president. As he said back in 2015, I'd like to be the president who solved the Middle East problem. That's quite an ambitious undertaking, but he may well think that, hey, this is my opportunity to be the man who's going to solve the Middle East problem. Now, to do that, you have to bite the bullet, and you're going to have to confront Israel. But since he's not seeking another term in office, he may well do that. He doesn't even need all that money. He doesn't need the Miriam Adelson money. He may well think that, well, now I can actually apply pressure against Israel. I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but it is quite a possibility. There's no love lost between him and Bibi. He obviously still harbors a grudge over the fact that Netanyahu recognized Biden's election victory in 2020, was among the first to call Biden and to congratulate him. He's brought up several times his resentment of Netanyahu abandoning him on the whole assassination of General Soleimani. They were supposed to be a joint American-Israeli venture, at least according to Trump, but Netanyahu pulled out at the last minute, and so America had to carry the can. So he resents that. So it's possible that I think he would that he finally would bite the bullet and address the issue of this American blank check to Israel, which has been so catastrophic for the Middle East.
Yeah, and you talk about solving, as you say, it's a massive problem, has been for years. Just remind us in short, if you like, in brief, Georgia, how did we get here? How did the issue arise, and what would a potential solution look like?
Well, the issue arose, of course, was the British mandate of Palestine, which obviously the British had an interest in maintaining good relations with the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, and of course the Arab leaders in the Middle East. But the British had also made a commitment through the Balfour Declaration, which was repeated as part of the mandate, was that the British would create a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. Now, it wasn't really spelled out what exactly a Jewish national homeland would mean, but once Jews started arriving, the indigenous population pretty much figured out that eventually a Jewish state was going to be created. And that's what in fact happened. There's more and more Jews started arriving, and with a view to creating a separate Jewish state. So that was the origin. And then of course then we had the war in 1948, which followed the United Nations partition plan, which was supposed to create a Jewish state and a Palestinian Arab state. That didn't come about. It was the war, and then the new Israeli state grabbed a lot more territory that was actually allotted by the United Nations partition plan. But those were not the final borders of Israel. That was just simply kind of preliminary borders, which came as a result of the 1948 war. And that went on until 1967, when I think Israel provoked a war and then seized the two parts of mandatory Palestine that Israel didn't have. So you had the partition plan, Israel creation, and then you had the West Bank and the Gaza, which were also part of that mandatory Palestine. Israel grabbed that, and essentially was always with a view to create a greater Israel, but of course it was very difficult because you had a lot of non-Jews living in those territories. So that's gone on since 1967. And then there was, of course, the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords of 1993 put forward, the basis for a kind of the solution for this conflict, which is named that those two pieces of territory, the West Bank and the Gaza, occupied by Israel, would comprise a Palestinian state. But of course, that never really came about. Israel continued building the settlements. It continued making life intolerable, particularly for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And so we are now. We are almost 30 years on since Oslo, and we're further away from that Palestinian state, which was envisaged, than we're further away than ever. So what would be the final outcome? Well, the only possible outcome is Oslo, which is the two-state solution. But then Israel would have to give up its this aspiration for a greater Israel, the aspiration to take the whole of that mandatory Palestine and declare it all to be the state of Israel. And no Israeli leader has really been prepared to do that. They play along with it. They have, in public, we're still interested in some sort of a two-state solution. But in practical terms, they're doing everything possible to make sure that it never happens.
Yeah, and you raise an interesting point. You and I have discussed this beforehand about actually Benjamin Netanyahu's position, and actually there's an interest for him to keep the war going, isn't there? Effectively, because once the war stops, and we hope that it does stop, then what's going to happen? People will start shining a spotlight on him because he's got a few questions to answer himself, hasn't he?
Well, he does have a few questions to answer. However, I have to say that Netanyahu's dominance of the Israeli political scene is such that I'm somewhat skeptical that anything will ever happen to him. And I don't think he's really worried that anything will happen to him. I mean, he's been really dominant in Israeli politics for 30 years. I mean, he's been there at the top for 30 years. I mean, all the various leaders have come and gone. They've disappeared. We've kind of forgotten about them. It's still Bibi Netanyahu. And now, and while a lot of Israelis probably detest him, they also say, "Hey, he's a success. He's delivered for us." They don't mind his policies. I mean, they don't like him, and they don't like his domestic policies. They don't like those Supreme Court reforms that his government proposed. They don't like that, but they say, "Hey, look what he's done. He's pushed Hamas out." I mean, they say he's going to defeat Hamas. And look what he did. He killed Nasrallah. He killed all those Hezbollah leaders. Nobody thought that could be done. He did it. So he has the wind in his back. And that's why I'm somewhat skeptical that there's really any serious move in Israel to get rid of him, because I think Israelis think no other leader could have pulled this off. So all those things that he has done, those attacks, I think terrorist attacks on Hezbollah leaders, assassinations, all of those are actually very popular among Israelis. I mean, and again, all the things that he's done in Gaza, the 43,000 killed in Gaza, that's quite popular. No one is saying, oh, this is really horrific. I mean, there are a few dissident Israelis like Gideon Levy and so on, but they're not representative of the Israeli public as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, and nobody, obviously, the international condemnation of the genocide in Gaza, and people are sort of turning around and saying that there are questions to be asked. There's a warrant out for his arrest. What's his reaction going to be to that?
Well, I mean, yes. Well, I don't think the warrant has ever been issued. I think that's the Karim Khan said that he's going to seek an arrest warrant for Netanyahu, but the arrest warrant hasn't been issued, and which itself is very interesting because remember when Karim Khan said he was going to seek out an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. There was no problem at all. Within minutes, the arrest warrant was issued. This still hasn't happened. Notice there's also a scandal embroiling Karim Khan. Miraculously, suddenly he's dealing with all sorts of sexual allegations. So it was entirely predictable that would happen. So I don't think for one moment that anyone's going to attempt to arrest Netanyahu. And if anyone were to do it, they would get the full weight of the United States against them. I mean, if anyone actually tried it, Netanyahu visited the country, and some country then tried to try to have him arrested, he'd be in the Americans' crosshairs. So that's it's not going to happen. And in fact, the ICC, by doing this, has really alienated the United States. I mean, the United States, of course, is not a signatory of the Rome Treaty, and it never ratified it or anything. But now it's actively very hostile to the ICC precisely because this prosecutor dared to talk about issuing an arrest warrant against Netanyahu. So I don't think he needs to worry too much about that. I mean, I think yeah, go on.
Yeah, no, well, what I was going to say, George, is that, as you say, it's sort of he's threatened to issue an arrest warrant, which is a strange thing to do, isn't it? You sort of talk about it. I don't know what he was hoping to achieve as a result of that, because it's a fairly easy process to issue the warrant, isn't it?
It's a fairly easy process because with these kinds of international courts and international tribunals, they are run by the prosecutors. I mean, the judges are really just rubber stamps. I mean, the prosecutors run the show. I mean, that was all the true about the Yugoslavia tribunal, the Rwanda tribunal. They're run by the prosecutors. So that the prosecutor says, hey, I have a prima facie case that, war crimes have been committed here. The judges are just a rubber stamp to say, yeah, okay, you got to put, here's your arrest warrant. So the whole idea that somehow, well, the judges are sort of thinking about it, it's absurd. I think he did it. It was I think it was a publicity stunt. I think he'd come under a lot of pressure because the ICC's impartiality was called into question. You're saying, hey, well, you're very quick to issue arrest warrants. His predecessor was at the ICC issued an arrest warrant against Muammar Gaddafi, even though they never conducted any kind of proper investigation in Libya. So they have no problem with doing things like that. But here there's this terrible war that was going on in Gaza. And the ICC clearly had jurisdiction. I mean, the ICC's jurisdiction had already been established some years earlier. So there were all sorts of questions. Well, why isn't the ICC doing anything? Because the Palestinian Authority had applied to the ICC, and so basically the ICC had jurisdiction. But nothing had happened. So that's why he was under a lot of pressure to do something. And then he kind of did something. He issued a statement saying, well, he's going to seek an arrest warrant. And then, of course, he did it with, try to balance it. Well, one arrest warrant for Netanyahu, one for Sinwar. But then nothing happened. And then we haven't heard anything more about this. So I guess the judges are still thinking, stroking their chins and thinking about, well, I don't know, is there really a prima facie case here?
It is extraordinary because there will still be questions to be answered, and the horrendous images that we see and the horrendous reports and the damage that has been caused. Clearly, there will be people who will be demanding, at least, at the very least, an investigation, won't there?
Well, there will be, but the problem is that the ICC it really has badly discredited itself. It's been so one-sided in all of its activities. I mean, it's gone after, not, it obviously went after Gaddafi, but then it's gone after various African leaders, but it hasn't gone after any Western powers. So there was a whole long to do about the British. I mean, the British are actually a signatory of the Rome Treaty. The British did ratify the ICC, and there was a long, protracted investigation of whether the British had committed war crimes in Iraq, and it dragged on for years. But in the end, the ICC decided, well, we can rely on the UK authorities to investigate themselves. So that was entirely predictable. So the ICC has been shown to be very one-sided in its application, and of course, none of the great powers are actually signatories of the Rome Treaty. Russia is not, the United States is not, China is not, India is not. So it's a very dubious organization. It has no affiliation with the United Nations. So it really is a kind of a voluntary thing that, you can sign on to it. You don't have to sign on to it. But there are ways that the ICC can worm its way in and declare that it has jurisdiction, as in the case of the Middle East, because although the Palestinians are a signatory to the Rome Treaty, so that gives the ICC jurisdiction. But though Israel, of course, is not. Same with the Russia and Ukraine. Russia obviously is not a signatory, but Ukraine got in on the ICC and said, well, yeah, we will accept ICC jurisdiction for everything, any crimes committed on Ukrainian soils after 2015. So they made that very stipulation. That gave the ICC some jurisdiction. But the point is that all of these kinds of double standards and, look this way and look that way, has kind of discredited the ICC as any serious, impartial judicial body.
Yeah, and you talk about the being discredited. So what do you think of the future then of the ICC?
Well, I don't think it has much of a future. I really think that these kinds of international tribunals are really, they're so politicized. They're so, used by, the great powers for their purpose. So they're like the Americans, who, of course, famously, I mean, Clinton signed onto the Rome Statute, but the United States refused to ratify it. And then George W. Bush withdrew America's signature. And then the United States Congress passed legislation, which is, I think, it's called the Hague Rescue Act, so that if anybody in the world attempts to arrest any American with a view to handing them over to the ICC in The Hague, that gives the United States the right to invade that country and liberate that imprisoned American, and indeed to invade Holland to liberate an imprisoned American. So now that's America's attitude to the ICC, but it's also, quite happy to use the ICC as a propaganda weapon. So when the ICC prosecutor issued his indictment of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 at the height of the NATO bombing of Libya, the Obama administration rejoiced and said, "Oh, look, see, we said, Muammar Gaddafi was a terrible person, and the ICC has confirmed it." So they will use it for propaganda purposes, just like the Americans were clapping their hands with glee when Karim Khan issued his arrest warrant against Putin. But what is that? When you have any judicial body that is so politicized, then it has no real basis and no one respects it. And what's happened now, the fact that you had this Karim Khan announcing, "Oh, I'm going to seek an arrest warrant," and then nothing happens. And I would say, "Well, why didn't anything happen?" Well, obviously because the ICC is so politicized that they're terrified that if they really issued an arrest warrant against Netanyahu, there would be probably a very, very serious consequences for the ICC.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, but it does go, as I say, to that sort of credibility, and again, the spotlight will shine on then. You mentioned about Ukraine and Russia. What's the solution there?
Well, I think I mean, obviously, a solution would have been, a long time ago. I mean, it's you'd have to say that when we found out recently, well, we didn't find it out, but it was confirmed what the peace terms that had been offered to Ukraine in April 2022, what they were at Istanbul, those very peace terms that Ukraine was ready to accept. They were very favorable to Ukraine and very unfavorable to Russia. Russia was really ready to make extraordinary concessions.
And just
Ukraine,
remind us what those terms were. What
yeah,
was
the terms essentially, the most important aspect of the Istanbul terms was that Ukraine would not seek membership of NATO. Ukraine would be a neutral state, which isn't a big deal because that was the Ukraine's declaration of state sovereignty in 1990 said precisely, explicitly, Ukraine will be a neutral power. Ukraine will not join any military alliances. So that was no big deal. There would be no, foreign troops obviously stationed in Ukraine, no missiles in Ukraine. There were, limitations on the, Ukrainian military. But in terms of territory, Ukraine wasn't being asked to cede any territory. Even the issue of Crimea was basically kicked forward for a few years. We're going to deal with it for the next 15 years. The issue of the Donetsk and Lugansk, which incidentally Russia had recognized as independent. Again, Ukraine wasn't being asked to make any concessions on that. The sole concession, if you can call it that Ukraine was being asked to make was no NATO membership. And then Boris Johnson, he goes to Kiev and tells them, "Hey, why sign this? We've got the Russians on the run." And then Ukraine withdrew its signature. So that was the deal then. That was April 2022. Now the war has obviously cost an enormous number of lives. And it's hard to see exactly how this is going to play out. I mean, if we want to wager a guess, I mean, if Trump wins the election, then I would suspect that Trump and Vance would probably push for Ukraine to accept, some loss of territory, essentially a ceasefire along the current lines of contact. Ukraine wouldn't have to make any public concession. They wouldn't have to say, "Oh, that's it. We recognize Donetsk and Lugansk as independent or a part of Russian Federation." Nothing like that would be asked of them. But they basically push them for some kind of a ceasefire. And then the issue of NATO membership would be kind of kicked down the road. Nothing further. That's, I think, what Trump and Vance would probably push for. Trump hasn't spelled that out. J.D. Vance has spelled that out. Because Trump isn't no great fan of NATO. Pretty much tell them, yeah, look, I mean, what the hell are we're going to have the wars and international crises over NATO, which I don't even give a damn about. So that I think is a possibility. If Harris wins, then I think it just goes on. I think then the United States just goes on fueling this war, and then who knows what happens. I mean, as long as a war goes on, kind of anything is possible.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, you're saying that the world will be a safer place if Trump is effectively re-elected from his previous term.
Yeah. I think so. I think so. I actually do think that Trump would like to see these wars brought to an end. He doesn't really want them to overshadow his presidency. I think he wants to accomplish things And then, because if he doesn't, then in fact the next 4 years are just going to be embroiled in these wars, just like his first term was embroiled in the whole Russiagate nonsense, and now it's going to be embroiled in effectively Biden's wars. I mean, they're both in Biden's wars, and so he basically Biden's wars would then dominate Trump's term, which makes no sense.
Sure. And finally, then, George, to what extent can the UK play a role in any of this in ensuring peace?
Well, I mean, the UK obviously could play a role, but unfortunately, both under Tories and Labour, the UK has taken a very belligerent stance, particularly on Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has been, an absolute obsession with both Sunak, with Truss, and now with Starmer. So I don't see anything good coming out of Britain, and I think it'll be up to the Americans to decide. I think if Starmer had wanted to remove the restraints on the use of the Storm Shadow missiles. I suspect. I mean, Biden has so far has said no. I suspect that Harris will probably say yes. I think she'll probably try to prove that she's even tougher on Ukraine than Biden was. So I don't think anything good will come out of Britain then. And as for the Middle East, the problem there is that the Americans call the shots. Britain can say what it likes, but the United States just isn't going to pay any attention to it. So even if Starmer is a little more even-handed, if one could even say that, than the United States, it doesn't really make any difference. The United States isn't listening at all to what London is saying. The United States is, pretty unreservedly supporting Israel, except when it might damage re-election prospects in the United States. Otherwise, essentially, it's been a United States blank check for Israel.
Okay. George Szamuely, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Andrew.